Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation to come here to speak this morning. I'm always delighted to come to the McGill School. And thank you too, and thanks Joe for putting housing on the agenda, because it isn't always on the agenda, and I think it's very important, particularly today, with the situation with regard to housing. And I'm going to speak to you from my own experience of working in this area for over 30 years now. But I'll start by maybe saying something about where we're coming from in order to look at where we're going. Since the 1990s, there has been a tendency in this country to believe that the market can meet all our housing need. And that philosophy had such a grip on political thinking that we virtually built no social housing. And today we're seeing the result with over 90,000 households on housing waiting lists. That is 3 times what it was in 1993. As you know, from 2002 onwards, the Celtic Tiger shifted from being based on real growth in productivity and wealth to relying on property speculation and construction. We allowed greed and speculation to dictate our housing provision, and this was a very flawed policy. And that flawed policy drove the boom. Our failure to see housing as a social need or as a social good, and seeing it instead as a driving force for our economy, led to the property bubble that was bound to be punctured in 2007 and 2008. And we all know what happened then with the crash. And we all know the damage that was done to our economy and to our people. Inevitably, house building in the commercial sector grew to a halt. But less inevitably, house building in the social sector also stopped, because successive governments, and later the Troika, slashed capital expenditure in social housing. We are seeing now the result of our prolonged failure to create and implement a socially beneficial housing policy. We're seeing it in the form of a severe housing crisis and rising levels of homelessness right across the country, in our cities and in our towns. The figures are alarming, but more appalling is the human fear and the human suffering and the loss that these statistics represent. To be fair to the current government, they're certainly attempting to respond to the housing challenges. And we hear a lot, and there's a lot of talk, as Conor said, about housing policies, and we have different housing policies. There's a lot of talk about providing houses. But there are serious gaps in the government strategies, and I want to identify some of these gaps now. The first gap has to do with the private rented sector. Right now, 20% or more of our population are living in the private rented sector. Only 10% are living in social housing. And here is the first gap. We have no strategy for the private rented sector. The National Economic and Social Council recently outlined a vision for secure occupancy for this sector, but this has not yet been taken up by the government. Having so many people relying on the private rented sector without a robust policy of secure occupancy and rent certainty is fraught with difficulties. In January of this year, at the Labour Party's National Conference, Minister Anne Kelly promised to introduce rent certainty for landlords and tenants. But in the intervening months since then, rents have continued to escalate, and there's been no action from the Minister or the government. Rent supplement was supposed to help people to stay in their homes if they lost their jobs. But this supplement has been cut several times in an attempt to drive down rents in the crash. Rents have shot up, competition for accommodation is intense, and people are becoming homeless as a result. And we are seeing the catastrophic results of this situation every day in Focus Ireland as more and more newly homeless families arrive to us. Last month in June, we had 72 newly homeless families arrive looking for help. We have seen families, whole families, 4, 5, 6, living in one room in a hotel without any facilities to play or to cook. We've seen families sleeping in cars. We've seen parents giving their children to their friends and neighbours so that they can sleep rough. As we speak here, there are 1,200 children living in emergency accommodation. Over 800 of those are living in hotel rooms. And this is because of the complete failure of regulation of the private rented sector and support for families who can't afford to pay their rent. There is almost no social housing. There is a critical shortage of the private rented sector. And even if they can find a place to rent, the level of rent supplement is not enough to make renting affordable for low-income families. For these families, the outlook is bleak. And as we listen to the voices of these families, after their experience of being priced out of their homes, they're very clear they don't want to return to that kind of instability and insecurity. Since even our most ambitious programs for social housing will not come on stream immediately, it will require many families to find their homes in the private rented sector, and there's a real urgency in creating and ensuring that they have security in this. The second gap has to do with the short-term plan for housing. The government, as has been said, has a detailed social housing strategy, which was launched at the end of last year, and which outlines a commitment to the provision of 35,000 houses, social houses, by the year 2020. Those in that sector, of course, welcomes that. It's the kind of planning we've been waiting for years, and will cooperate in any way we can with this implementation. However, there's a number of obstacles to be overcome before these homes can be delivered. One major challenge is that the local authorities have scaled down their house building operations in the last 10 years because they haven't been building any houses. They now have to get their operations up to speed, and they have to do it quickly, and this will have to be resourced, and this will have to be done by the Department of the Environment, and this is challenging. And even if these problems are overcome, it will take a minimum of 18 months before we see any new social housing coming on stream, and sometimes it will take much longer. Furthermore, the government continues to rely very heavily on the social sector acquiring property from the private sector for the next several years. This may be unavoidable because of the time that will elapse between proposing house building projects and the people being able to move in. But there's a great concern that the private property that it is proposing to acquire is simply not there, and certainly not there at the price the state is prepared to pay. And here is the second gap in the government's housing strategy. There's no clear plan as to how we're to get through the next few years of continued housing shortage. And this gap is going to have severe consequences for the poorest and the most vulnerable families. The next few years raises two challenges for us. The first question is, what can we do to speed up the delivery of housing without undermining the key objective of providing good quality housing in sustainable communities with access to employment, education, culture and recreational facilities? I think we are obliged to give fair consideration to any mechanism that will speed up the provision of housing, including changes in funding, in planning regulation, in building techniques, as long as they're compatible with the objective of providing good quality houses in sustainable communities. It also means taking radical action against land hoarding. The second question is, what measures are necessary to prevent homelessness while housing remains a scarce resource? Even if we have a medium-term plan, we cannot leave the short term to look after itself. Such an approach would mean that the poorest households and the most vulnerable families and individuals would be pushed out of the market. We urgently need measures to protect tenants from excessive price rises and to protect them also when the banks take possession of rental properties. As part of the strategy for the immediate future, much more action must be taken to keep people in their homes. There are many people struggling to pay their mortgages, and government must take a firm hand with the banks and financial institutions to ensure that we do not see an avalanche of repossessions of family homes within the next year. In Focus Ireland, we're seeing a sharp rise in the number of families who have mortgage arrears who are coming to us for help, and in the number of former homeowners who are becoming homeless. The third gap in our housing strategy is perhaps the most fundamental. We need to answer the question, what is the ethical basis of our housing policy? If this question is not adequately answered, we will undoubtedly return to the errors of the past. If our housing policy is to be sustainable and contribute to social justice, it must be based on a recognition that a home is a human right and not a commodity on the free market. Access to adequate housing is fundamental. It's fundamental to survival, and it's one of the foundational rights that without it, the other rights would be meaningless. The International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1966 placed adequate housing along with food and clothing as the cornerstone of an adequate standard of living. In Focus Ireland, we believe that enshrining such a right in our Constitution would be the right way to go, the right to a home, and this would vindicate Ireland's international human rights commitment on the right to adequate housing. This would also underpin policies to reduce homelessness and create a fairer approach to the provision of housing. We have campaigned for many years on this issue. In fact, when Focus Ireland was founded, this was our vision, that everybody should have a right to a place they can call a home. And we've campaigned on that for many years. Last year, the Constitutional Convention recommended, as part of the broad discussion on economic and social and cultural rights, that the right to a home would be included in the Constitution. We are now calling on the government to put this to the people in a referendum. As we look towards the centenary of our independence, we have a lot to be proud of, and we have a lot to be not so proud of. And housing is one of them. We've allowed people's basic requirement, a place they can call a home, a place they can live with dignity, a place they can rear their families in safety, in security, and with privacy. We've allowed that to become a debased currency. We've played the market with people's basic human needs, and this is nothing short of indecent. But we have not always behaved that way as a nation. When we look back at the history of the state, we can celebrate the fact that the provision of decent housing for our people at an affordable rent was a mainstay of the Irish state for several decades. The disastrous policies of the last 30 years should not be allowed to obscure the fact that this is something we were very good at when we were much poorer than we are today. And there's no reason, given profound commitment, political commitment, and a constitutional change, that it cannot be something we can do well again.